G'day, Jeff. It's very nice to meet you virtually all the way from Melbourne. And congratulations on your book, Crimes Against Nature, which I read in maybe not in one sitting, but I read it very quickly. I found it a very stimulating read and very well worthwhile.
And you enjoyed it.
Yeah, mate. Well, it deserves a wide readership. So why did you choose to produce this book now?
Look, I think, like everyone, I'm confronting the almost existential problem we face now with climate change, and in some ways, global heating is now, the preeminent question of our age, and it intersects with almost every political issue. And so if you're someone who's interested in politics, I think you really do have to grapple with some of the issues around climate change. And I think one of the reasons I wanted to write this book is I think that the mainstream discourse around climate change gets almost everything wrong. And I don't think that that's a coincidence, but it makes it very, very difficult to even proceed towards any sort of solutions. And so what I wanted to do was to try to write a book that was, as much as possible, without being dishonest, an optimistic book, a book that actually suggested there is something that we can do about climate change, and we are not inexorably living through a period of, humanity's decline. And so I wanted to make a few really simple points that I feel are missing from this debate. The first of which is that climate change is not the fault of the majority of the population. We're so often told that we're all responsible for this. We're lazy and we're greedy and there's too many of us, and that's the reason why this is happening. And I wanted to say that was wrong. And as part of that, I wanted to say that not only are ordinary people not the problem, but they are potentially the solution. There are alternatives to the disaster that we're heading for, and that that ordinary people are key to realizing those alternatives. So that's why I wanted to write the book.
Yeah. Well, you've written it as 13 interconnected essays. So there's 13 chapters with an introduction and a conclusion. Each chapter can be read independently of the others, but they do flow from one to the other. I particularly liked the way in which you wrote it as a narrative. I don't want to sound a bit twee here, but you were telling a story in each chapter, unfolding a narrative. So why did you choose that particular style and tone?
Climate change is a really difficult thing to write about. It's a really difficult issue to engage with politically for a whole variety of reasons. One reason is just that I think a lot of people now find it so overwhelming and so depressing that they don't want to engage with it at all. You see the photos of the polar bears looking sad because there's no ice or whatever it is, and you think, I can't deal with this. I feel so hopeless. I can't deal with it. So that's one problem. The second problem is that it often gets very technical very quickly. And so for a lot of people, it's just, okay, they know that climate change is a thing, but they feel like it's a thing that only scientists can talk about because, they can't understand the science of it. So what I wanted to do was try to find a way to make this an engaging issue, and an issue a story in which people could put themselves. And so I tried to write it around particular issues that I thought were important, but also particular issues where I thought you could perhaps say some things that were a little bit unexpected or a little bit contrary to what people might think you were going to say, to try and make the book more engaging and more interesting, and not just, some misery porn about how bad things are going to be. And yeah, so that was the basis of the structure, I guess. It was an attempt to try and find engaging ways into an issue, because I understand full well why people turn off for it. You know, and I'm the same. Sometimes you see the news about some species going into extinction, you think, I just don't want to deal with that. Well, we have to deal with it, and we have to find ways to talk about it. And I think that once you start getting engaged in a different kind of story, a story in which ordinary people are not either sort of passive victims or kind of incorrigible villains, but are actually potentially agents of social change, it becomes a lot easier to talk about.
Yeah, right. Okay, so what is the intended readership of your book? Who were you aiming it at?
Yeah, it's a difficult question, isn't it? I mean, I wanted, when I started researching this book, I wanted to reach the kind of people who understand that climate change is an issue, believe that is serious. I'm not particularly interested in talking to climate denialists. I think at this stage that, there's not really very much to say, but I wanted to talk to people who think that this is a problem, but feel overwhelmed by it or feel completely demoralized by it. And so I wanted to try to find a way to talk to those people and try to win some really fundamental arguments. Like I say, fundamental arguments about what the agency is that might address this problem and what the kinds of strategies might be that might lead us to the other side. Because I feel that until we tackle those really foundational issues, we're going to get nowhere with this issue. And, that's been the story of the last decades, hasn't it? There's been, like so many kind of wrong strategic directions taken around climate change, so many dead ends. And because the clock is ticking, we can't afford that anymore. So what we need to do is we need to go back to first principles. We need to say, okay, what is causing this issue and what are the solutions? And that's what that's what the book, in its own fairly modest way, tries to do.
Yeah. Well, one of the solutions that's being peddled at the moment is electric cars. We should all get electric cars. Hey, I've got an electric car, I should tell you, and I own it communally. I'm one of 4 owners of this car. But anyway, but that's my personal attempt to try and dodge the bullet of car culture. You actually take the issue of car culture on head on in your book,
so to speak.
Yes.
Nice pun there.
Where's it come from? Where does car culture come from?
Yeah, so I'm going to start the book with that almost as a little case study, because I think in some ways the question, when car culture is discussed, it's very often used as almost the paradigmatic case of ordinary people being greedy and lazy and selfish and wanting their own private cars and saying, to hell with the planet, I'll just drive my gasoline car and screw the rest of you. And that's why it's really interesting to look at the development of the motor car, particularly in the United States, which is really the foundational country for car culture. Because when you look at the history, the story is completely unlike the story that most of us kind of take for granted. It's not a question of ordinary people selfishly demanding, I want a private car. It's much more a story of actually, from very early on, people being quite aware of how destructive cars were and resisting them in all sorts of ways. So in the 1920s, there was a tremendous pushback to try and keep cars off the road because people saw how horrendously dangerous they were. And like so many of the issues I talk about in the book, this was addressed by the car manufacturers with this phenomenal PR campaign to try and normalize people to the notion of private cars taking over the streets. And as you alluded to at the start, there's also this question of the centrality of the internal combustion engines responsible for so much carbon pollution. And again, when you look back into the development of the car, you discover that right from the start, there were all kinds of other alternatives that were made available, particularly electric cars that, you know, in the very early days of the motoring industry in the United States were seen as, in fact, a better alternative, and in fact were very viable in a whole series of American cities before they were destroyed for various reasons by the car companies. So again, I mean, in some ways, the story of car culture is almost a paradigmatic example for the kind of argument that I try to make throughout the book, that rather than people demanding these things were in some ways forced upon us. And it's not, I'm not trying to suggest that ordinary people are environmental saints or anything like that, but you can see very clearly with the coming of car culture that there was a conscious and deliberate campaign by the auto manufacturers to destroy the alternatives to cars, and as such to make cars essential to everybody, to most people's normal lives. So they created the context in which people then started to demand cars, because cars became sort of central to people's lives. But the point is, and I think it is a really fundamental one, this wasn't a natural process. It was a process that developed through a whole series of struggles, and it could have been otherwise. So rather than people wanting these things, actually they were forced upon them. And, you know, had some of those campaigns been more successful, you know, the car culture we now take for granted wouldn't have come into being in quite the way that we see it today.
I thought I love the quote from Raymond Williams that you've got on page 15 of your book, where he points out that the notion that every man is a king in his car, which, you know, comes from Ayn Rand, is actually an illusion, that every aspect of driving your car is actually socially conditioned. Do you want to talk about that at all?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the cities that we live in now were redesigned to make cars possible. And again, this was done often in the face of tremendous resistance from ordinary people. And once that redesigning happens, once we end up in a situation where, you know, we are living so far away from where we work and so far away from our friends and so far away from our families, cars then become kind of essential bait, you know. So in that sense, cars are a solution to a problem that cars create.
Yes.
And so, you know, and again, it's, you know, like in some ways, it's a trivial example in the context of a much greater environmental problems that we face, but it's a kind of paradigmatic one, and you see these same kind of debates playing out with almost all of the, you know, the major issues connected with the environmental crisis. So, you know, I mean, I spent a great deal of time in the book talking about, you know, the efforts of the plastics industry to normalize plastic in the face of tremendous opposition from consumers who didn't want plastic, you know, and actually tried to do things like recycle their plastic bags. And, you know, in fact, there was a tremendous campaign to stop people recycling plastic bags. So again, you know, we're often told that, you know, the problem is that the supermarkets want to stop, you know, all these plastic bags being handed out, but the customers demand them. Actually, that historically, that could not be further from the truth. It was exactly the opposite way around. And so what we see again and again is this tremendous slander that's directed at ordinary people from the corporations who are responsible for climate change, blaming us for the things that they made possible.
But do you think in general that there is an unbridgeable divide between human beings and nature?
Yeah, so, I mean, I think I said before that if we are going to get out of the environmental catastrophe that's confronting us now, we have to go back to first principles. And the most fundamental of those principles is, I think, trying to work through our relationship with nature. So, you know, when I first started reading socialist theory was when I was at university in the early 90s. And it was an era when, you know, academic Marxism was dominated by by various kinds of post-structuralist theory. And it's only relatively recently that, you know, I've gone back to some of those texts and realized when you're talking about Marx and Marxist economics, what you are talking about is a theory of nature and a theory of how human beings relate to the natural world. So that kind of environmental, you know, what we would talk about now as environmental attitude is actually, it's not an additional add-on to Marxism. It's the fundamentals of the entire theory. So understanding that human beings are simultaneously part of nature, but also change nature. And as they change nature, they change themselves, is, I think, a really kind of crucial perspective to thinking about climate change. So, you know, I spend a chapter, for instance, talking about, you know, how we've got to get rid of the concept of wilderness, the notion that there's this sort of gulf between, you know, human society, which is in one place, and the wilderness, which is nature as untouched by people, that is outside of us. And in fact, you know, the whole concept of wilderness is fundamentally problematic because there is almost no aspect of the natural world that hasn't been changed by human interactions. Precisely because we are part of the natural world, we change nature wherever we go. The question then becomes not how do we avoid changing nature as if we could somehow step out of the natural world, but how do we make sure that the impact we have on the natural world is a positive one and not a destructive one. And I think it's a really important question for Australians in particular to come to terms with, because of course we have the example of, you know, 40,000 years or more of Indigenous civilization on the Australian continent, where we have an entire culture that did not live in a wilderness, as, you know, the old kind of quite racist presentation would have it, but actually Indigenous people lived on a continent which they reshaped fundamentally by the way that they lived and the way they interacted with the natural world. The point being, however, that Indigenous culture developed over thousands of years to establish methods to improve the natural to improve the ecosystems, to enable animals and plants to flourish, to avoid destroying ecosystems, and so on and so forth. And I think that it's I mean, in some ways it's kind of obvious, but I think it's a really, really important point, because it goes to this argument. Well, okay, if human beings are able to live on Australia for 40,000 years in a society that doesn't destroy the natural world, but actually in some senses improves it, then our species is not somehow necessarily condemned to go around destroying nature wherever we see it. It is possible for us to have a more beneficial relationship with the natural world. The question is how we go about doing it. And that, I think, is, you know, is the fundamental question that we have to address. It's not that human beings are somehow a blight on the planet, that we destroy nature every time we touch it. That's not the case at all. In fact, we have tens of thousands of years of history that shows the opposite. But, you know, something happens, you know, in the modern era that fundamentally changes how we relate to nature, and that something is capitalism.
Yes.
And, you know, that's the problem we face.
Yeah. Now, there was an early cultural representation of the effects of capitalism in the form of Mary Shelley's novel Frankenstein, which you refer to in your book. What can Mary Shelley's Frankenstein tell us about capitalism?
Yeah, so that was an example of what I was talking about before, trying to find some ways to kind of take people into some of these debates. And Frankenstein is interesting. Well, partly it's interesting because it's a fantastic novel, but Shelley bases the novel on scientific experiments that were happening at the time with what was called galvanization, which was essentially the application of electricity to recently deceased animals or indeed humans. And various scientists discovered that you could apply electricity and the muscles would twitch as electrical impulses stimulated them. One of the most famous of those experiments was conducted by a guy called Andrew Ure, who wrote of applying a galvanic apparatus, essentially a battery, to the body of a recently executed criminal and making his arms twitch about in various ways. Well, it's a really kind of interesting and evocative story for a whole series of reasons. Partly that the executed criminal was a Scottish weaver, and this is a period when the weavers were engaged in really militant industrial struggle against the new factories that were coming into being. So Shelley was writing at a time when various industrial activists were being executed in mass hangings all across England. But it wasn't simply that the guy that Ure was experimenting on was, a representative of the most militant section of the proletariat. And so there's this sort of sense in which Ure sees this experiment as a way of this professor controlling the body of this dead weaver. That's one part of the story, but of course, people are familiar with Marx's Capital will know that name. That he goes on to be a very significant exponent of the new ideas of factory organisation. And you can see a direct link between his experiments with galvanization and his attempts to control this deceased weaver and the way he talks about how a factory should be operated, which is all about the factory should be a system to control the workers. So it's not about productivity in the abstract sense. It's about ensuring that the workers do exactly what you want them to do, and the machinery that you have at your disposal is essentially a way of ensuring your intelligence is the force that animates all of the people in your factory. And why that's significant to climate change is it goes to this argument about how human beings relate to the natural world, because what happens with the coming of capitalism is that the fundamental relationship that people have with the natural world, the way that human beings, find enough that they can eat or clothe themselves or shelter themselves, which is through their interaction with the natural world, is fundamentally changed, and that interaction becomes something which is controlled by not by ordinary people, but by the logic of capitalism. And the most sort of dramatic example of that, I guess, is the factory, which you are the guy who is, responsible for these Frankensteinish experiments on a dead weaver, is kind of the kind of founding father of this notion of the factory as a way of controlling workers. So again, I guess it goes to this argument I'm trying to make throughout the book, that rather than ordinary people being the architects of the destruction that we're seeing in the planet today, that in fact the whole nature of capitalism has been about taking that control away from us and subjecting us to the logic of capital accumulation, which is about endless expansion, irrespective of the human or environmental cost.
Yeah, well, one of the things about the development of the early factory system in Manchester was the development of steam power using the burning of coal which absolutely choked the atmosphere of Manchester. But as you relate in your book, it didn't have to be like that. There was an alternative before the development of steam power for those factories. Do you want to talk about that at all?
Yeah. So this is an argument I take from Anders Melm's book on fossil capital, which is a fantastic book. But he makes the point that we're told this narrative that the steam engine is just inexorable force, that it's a technological achievement which overcomes all obstacles simply because it's more efficient and it's more productive. But in fact, when you look at the history of its usage, actually, initially at least, it's less effective than the other alternatives, such as particularly water power, which was more reliable, was more stable, was cheaper, and was more efficient. But again, the overarching reason why steam triumphed and why fossil fuel became so central to the development of capitalism was to do with the utility of steam in controlling the workforce. So there's all sorts of reasons why the more sustainable and environmental friendly sources of power, such as water, were less attractive from the employer's point of view. One of which is simply that it was a lot easier for people to organise in the water powered mills than it was in these steam in factories that were powered by steam. One of the advantages of coal was that it was manoeuvrable, it could be taken to various places. It thus gave the employers far more power over their workers, and that primarily is the reason why it triumphed. So there are descriptions of workers' movements marching through Manchester, demanding stop the smoke, because they saw that the coal power was this hostile force that was being used to prevent them organising and to make them have to work in these ways that they didn't want to do. Now, again, it's, I'm not trying to say that somehow, the 19th century workers in Manchester were some environmental paragons who, foresaw the debates about climate change and somehow preemptively wanted to stop them. That's not the case at all. And I'm not, we don't have to think that ordinary people are saints, but the point is, again and again, you see the same story, that these incredibly destructive ways of living and of producing are enforced on ordinary people against their will. And, ordinary people didn't want to have to work in Manchester factories, didn't want to be choked by smoke, didn't want to be burned alive by boilers, and they tried to prevent these things happening. And because they were unsuccessful, well, fossil capital became more and more important, and now we are where we are. So again, I think it's really, really important, because this claim that it's all our fault is one of the major ideological weapons of the capitalists. Because if we are all to blame, then they're not to blame. You're to blame. It's your fault, Barry. You did it.
I feel it. Well, actually, right now, Scott Morrison is over in Europe, going to Glasgow for the climate change talks. I mean, personally, mate, I blame him a hell of a lot of what's going on. So in your view, why is it that our politicians can't lead us out of this climate disaster?
Yeah, see, I mean, I guess the fundamental argument I'm trying to make with this book is that there is no way out of this disaster without breaking the logic of the commodity, without breaking with the system of capitalism. So, in various chapters I talk about the nature of capitalism is that it's a system that sees every obstacle simply as a way of reorganizing itself for further growth. It's a system that has to continually expand, and has to expand blindly in an unplanned way. And I mean, as soon as you start to think about that, you can see why the whole mainstream debate is so ridiculous. Because, if you're committed to an economic system that must blindly expand every year, GDP must grow each and every year, then environmental problems are simply a matter of time. I mean, you cannot expand infinitely on a finite planet unless you think that somehow capitalism is going to dematerialize itself, that somehow that we are going to shift away from the direct effects that we have on the planet and develop some sort of dematerialized capitalism. And there's no evidence that is happening. And that's why I think that actually the left has to be much harder on arguments around things like green capitalism. That the idea that solar panels are going to save us is a fantasy. The idea that new battery technologies are going to save us a fantasy. That what in fact, if these new technologies take off, what we're in fact likely to see is them becoming the basis for a new round of capital accumulation around so-called green technology, which will just mean that it'll mean a few things. One of the points I make in the book is that there are almost no examples of a new energy source supplanting an old energy source. So, when say you end up with something like petroleum displacing coal, it doesn't mean that less coal is used in absolute terms. Less coal is used in relative terms, but in absolute terms, the use of petroleum actually enables the capitalists to dig up more coal. And that's been the case with every energy shift. And there's no reason to think that it won't be the case, even if renewables start to become a more potent force. But at the same time, that just shifting the technological basis of the capitalist system doesn't change the fundamental dynamic of capitalism. And, the environmental crisis isn't simply a question of climate change in and of itself. It's that, the ecosystem of the planet is being destroyed at almost every level. And so, a renewed bout of capital accumulation structure around so-called green capital isn't going to improve things. It's just going to intensify the strains that the planet is already under. And I think that's really, really important, because I suspect that because people are so despairing about the potential to do anything about climate change, there will be a lot of well-meaning lefties who will be quite prepared to sort of, fall in behind a vision of, business as usual, except with solar panels instead of coal. And it's not going to work.
Yes.
It's just not going to work, So, I think we have to face up. Marx says somewhere, ignorance never got never got anyone anywhere. And I think that's the case with climate change. It's not going to go away if we close our eyes. If we, we can't pretend that things aren't as bad as they are, and we can't try to hide the fact that we need a fundamentally different system. And if we don't get one, then things are going to be really bad. So the first step to solving a problem is recognizing the problem exists.
So what do you say to the people who say that the basic problem is that there's just too many people on the planet?
Yeah, so this is an old canard that comes up again and again. And so, I wanted to devote a chapter to this. And well, in fact, I wrote a few chapters where I tried to address what I think are some of the problems that the environmental movement has had, which has meant that even though ordinary people have time and time again tried to stand up against, you know, the destructive practices that capitalism has forced upon them, they have often been quite alienated from environmentalism. I think there's a number of reasons for that. But the argument about populationism, I think, is a particularly pernicious one, partly in terms of the political positions that it leads one to. As soon as one starts to say that there are too many people, you know, in a particular country, then immediately one starts to, the next question is, well, okay, who are the surplus people that we need to get rid of? And, you know, the answer is always the same. It's always the immigrants. It's always the, you know, people of a different color. It's always the, you know, people of the working class. You never get a kind of populationist campaigner like a Dick Smith saying, yes, there are too many people, therefore I'm going to, you know, top myself. You know, it's never me. I'm never the problem. It's always someone else. And I think, you know, in the current moment, the populationist arguments are particularly dangerous because we've seen already the beginnings of a right-wing environmentalism. So my previous book was about the Christchurch massacre, and of course, you know, the perpetrator of that massacre described himself as an environmentalist, and, you know, saw that you know, and presented his environmentalism around the notion that there are too many people, we need to get rid of some of them. And that's what he sort of was doing. And, you know, if we allow the right to claim this terrain, then we really are doomed, you know. So those are the political consequences. But more fundamentally, I mean, the problem with populationist arguments is that they well, they're just wrong. They don't actually work. That it's entirely possible to think of, you know, of countries and societies with large numbers of people that have been very, very wealthy, and countries with very small numbers of people that have been very, very poor. So while obviously in a purely mathematical sense, you know, the earth is a finite resource and there's only a certain number of people who can physically fit on it in a purely mathematical sense, but in terms of the allocation of social resources, it's never a question of the raw numbers of people. It's always a question of how people relate to each other. And as soon as you shift that debate from how people relate to each other to the numbers of people, then, you know, you're always moving the argument to the right. And so you're, you know, always on a hiding to nothing. So, you know, it's just one of it's an argument that's been around forever, but I think it is one of the arguments that we are going to have to face up with. And it goes back again to the point I've been making again and again. Like, one of the fundamental underpinnings of populationism is the notion that ordinary people are to blame. I mean, you know, you think of the logic of population is that ordinary people are to blame not for anything that they do, just by existing. There are too many people. It's your fault just by being alive. So, you know, there's nothing that follows from that. You can't do anything about being alive. So, you know, it's a counsel of despair, but it's one that points the finger at ordinary people once again.
Yeah. So look, at the end of your book, in the conclusion, you mentioned 12 things that people can do to solve the climate crisis. Do you want to talk about them? Do you want to try and summarize
you're trying to remember what they are?
12-step program, man. It's like Alcoholics Anonymous.
Well, so I wanted to try to, as I said, I wanted to try and make this an optimistic book about a not very optimistic topic, and in a political context where the options available to people seem very, very limited. So, you know, I try to make an argument about the viability of a planned economy and why that is the necessary solution to climate change. I've just actually got a piece in the Guardian at the moment making precisely that argument. You know, one of the real difficulties in the way that the mainstream debate about climate change proceeds is that it takes for granted the centrality of markets. And so most of the arguments are based around how is it we are going to find a way to make the market make us stop digging up coals. You know, and when you think about it like that, it's utterly unhinged. I mean, there's no other way in which we would say that, rather than saying, okay, here is this thing that we know we need to do, so let's do it. We have to say, here is this thing that we need to do. Let's find a way to make the market make us do it. I mean, so part of that argument is like, well, we have to do this because, you know, the markets are the only way to organize a human society. And so the claim I try to make is, well, that's patently not the case. And in fact, it's entirely possible for humans to deliberately and consciously decide what they produce and when. But of course, establishing a planned economy is not something that we're going to be able to do tomorrow. So I tried to sort of conclude with a few general points that perhaps people could take away in a context in which the political options available to most people are not necessarily that apparent. So I started by saying that people should be suspicious of attempts to blame the crisis on ordinary people. Now, again, I feel I've been saying that over and over again, but I think that it is going to be the constant refrain, and it's only going to get more intense as the crisis worsens, and as, you know, when COP26 collapses into chaos, it won't be the fault of politicians. It will be the fault of ordinary people. That's the way it's always presented. So even in terms of, you know, Scott Morrison's shenanigans, when you read the mainstream commentary around this, it's always presented, this is not Scott Morrison's fault. This is Scott Morrison trying to, you know, trying to deal with a recalcitrant electorate. You know, he wants to do the right thing, but he can't do it because of the voters. So I think we have to be really suspicious of any attempt to blame ordinary people without pretending that, you know, that we're all saints ourselves. But, you know, if there is any future, it lies, you know, with the proles, as Orwell said. So then I suggest that as part of that, I think that it's really important that we not allow ourselves to be guilt-tripped into individual solutions. Again, this is the, you know, the long and sorry history of debates about climate change. We'll get these presentations talking about, you know, what's happening in the atmosphere and how many million tons of carbon are going to the atmosphere. Then the next thing will be, okay, what are you doing with your recycling? Do you know what I mean? Like, as if the individual choices that you will make any conceivable difference. And so in the book, I talk about those sort of things and the way that, in fact, most of the corporations have deliberately and consciously tried to push for these kind of individual solutions like recycling. At the same time, they have deliberately set up the recycling system so they will make no difference at all. So you can recycle as much garbage you want. It's not going to make any difference at all. Most of it just gets burnt. So don't get tripped into, don't get guilt tripped into individual arguments. I go on to say that we need to be prepared to argue. I think that's one of the weaknesses of the left at the moment, is that because we've been isolated for so long, a lot of us are not actually very good at persuading other people. So, you know, like recognizing that we're in a minority, we have to start prosecuting these arguments and learning ways to make them palatable to other people. So neither pandering to people who disagree with us nor hectoring them. Trying to meet people where they're at and trying to persuade them, which is easier said than done, but it's what we have to do. At the same time, we have to expect that we are going to face opposition, that we are talking about a struggle for the fate of the planet. The stakes are really high. The moment we start to make any gains, we need to expect that there will be tremendous opposition. We saw briefly with, you know, Extinction Rebellion and the crackdown on them as to one form that will take. But, you know, you're not going to be popular making anti-capitalist arguments around climate change. You're just not. So we have to expect that we are going to face opposition. I'm just trying to make sure. And the other points, look, I won't go through them all. The other points are in terms of trying to find collective solutions, trying to find ways to organise locally, trying to find ways to organise in your workplace, trying to retain a degree of hope in a situation that we know, while it is extremely serious, will throw up opportunities. And we've seen them over the past year. We've seen, you know, I made the point that, you know, the demonstrations around Black Lives Matter were the biggest demonstrations ever in human history.
Mm.
So it's not like that there hasn't been, moments of breakthrough. And then at the same time, I think that it's really important that we should expect the unexpected. We're living through such an unstable period at the moment, and that the forms that resistance will take can't be predicted in advance. I mean, look, on the one hand, we knew that the environmental disaster would lead to all kinds of catastrophes, but who predicted COVID? Actually, when you look back at it, there are various scientists who are saying that this is something that could happen, but like nobody predicted how the last few years would play out. Well, that's what the future is going to look like. We should expect that the next year there is no return to normal now. That's COVID might ease or whatever, but we are in a period where, if the science is correct, we should expect intensified natural disasters of one form or another, whether that is bushfires or floods or heat waves or whatever it's going to be. And the political opportunities that might emerge from those are hard to predict. And so we need a certain degree of flexibility to be able to adjust to those. And, and to retain a degree of hope, these are serious times, but we have the tremendous resource that our side is infinitely bigger than their side, that the proportion of the planet who has an interest in overcoming climate change is far, far larger, far, far more significant than the proportion of the planet who has an interest in pushing for, continued ecological destruction. And that at least should be a source of some hope.
Okay, look, I want to thank you for producing this book. And I have a small list of people who I'm going to buy copies for Christmas. And yeah, mate, because I've been involved in so many conversations about climate change with all sorts of people. I mean, God, every day at work. And this is a very readable introduction to a set of ideas that a lot of people have not had contact with in their lifetime. I think it's a very valuable book, and I really thank you for producing it. And thank you for taking the time to talk to Green Left.
Thank you for the conversation, and thank you for your support, Barry.